Hi folks, welcome to a sort of bonus weekend podcast of the Lotus Eaters. We're going to be further exploring the Great Reset with Klaus Schwab's new book that Hugo has read for us and will be answering my questions on. Right, so how dire is the like, I don't know, demands, I almost want to say, from Klaus Schwab here?
Oh, well, Klaus Schwab and the people around him, they think that the situation is really dire,
Right.
the situation in the world in general. And so they want to remake the world. They want to introduce substantial changes to the way societies are run, economics is viewed, and politics is conceived, I guess, to make it so that these threats, these grave concerns are addressed in some way. And the way they want to do it is quite specific, and I'm going to get to them in a second, but I wanted to mention at the beginning that I actually view the Great Reset in a bit of a different way than it's mostly covered. I don't actually think it's that much of a reset, because what it does and what it wants to do is to intensify the current trends and what is happening at the moment. And so if you look at the tendencies that Western countries or countries around the world display at the moment, what the Great Reset wants to do is to push that forward much further and much faster.
So could we just summarize this as saying globalization?
I would. That's actually interesting because it's one of the things that I want to make a distinction in as well,
Right, okay.
between globalization and globalism,
Right, okay.
because I think those are different things, and I actually think that the way that Klaus Schwab and the people around him view globalization and globalism actually contributes to their wrong conclusions about what to do and what is beneficial for society.
Go ahead and explain it then. Let's hear it.
Right. So firstly, the globalism issue. I view globalization as an economic phenomenon that's basically, it's a summary of saying that the world is more connected than ever. It trades more than ever. Goods are flowing across the world, and therefore people get richer, people get more goods, cheaper goods, better services, and the world gets collectively more merry.
This isn't a new phenomenon. This is something that's been happening for many millennia at this point. People trading across large distances, but the term sort of globalization and globalism, I agree with you. There's a different implication in the terms. Global trade is something that I think everyone would agree with. Yeah, sure, we should be able to trade with people across the world, but there isn't in that an implicit assumption of a loss of sovereignty, is there?
Yeah, and you mentioned the Silk Road before, and
Yeah.
I think that when Klaus Schwab, or when basically anyone talks about globalization, they mean what's been going on since, let's say, the end of the Second World War, but also they might mean the process that was happening before World War One as well, under slightly different
Yeah,
circumstances.
like we talk about the British Empire or something.
Exactly,
like that.
something like that. But also the deepening and furthering of international trade and cooperation before the First World War. That's a very well documented period of history. And so this economic concept, this economic phenomenon, is, I think, can be very well separated from the political phenomenon, which I would classify as globalism, which is a push for international organizations that are in existence today to take on a role as a quasi-world government at some point in the future, but at least now to perform some government-like functions on the world scale.
Yeah, could we describe them as maybe stewards of the world, something like that? They don't have necessarily official governmental power, but they are very well listened to and regarded by governments around the world. Is that fair?
Somewhat. I think the thing is, international law is a complicated thing, and part of it is compulsory, part of it is something that states need to do and have to do and have agreed that they will follow that, and part of that is advisory or something that is more fluid and is not mandatory. What also complicates the picture is that international law is enforced by states, right? So it's not enforced by any higher force. It doesn't have the same structure as domestic law. And so if you say stewards, it is appropriate in some way, but not in others, because some of the things have the legal nature in them, so that you can actually view them in a very similar way as some of domestic legislation, right? But at the same time, a lot of the organizations in the international space are just advisory and are just political and basically
governments voluntarily sign up to these things,
perform the functions of pressure groups, or something like that. And so some of international law is for states to sign up for and to then follow, but other parts are just what states end up doing based on pressure that is coming from the international space. Right. And so I would say that the Great Reset is a movement, is a push for something that is at the start being enforced in this way. So states are pressured to adopt these changes voluntarily, but at the same time, when these movements grow and when they gain more credence, then they are able to be implemented through the UN, through, for example, the Security Council, which the decisions and resolutions of which are binding or on the UN member states. It then gets pushed through those means as well, which means that states have to follow it, and there's a large and serious obligation and expectation that they will do so.
Right. So, and this doubtless why Trump's pulling out of the Paris Agreement and things like this are so offensive to the sort of Trudeauian faction in the discussion, right? It's assumed that America is going to carry on with these sort of programs, and Trump seems to be directly in opposition to it.
What is interesting as well is the kind of fight between the UN and the US in the international arena, because the UN is a product of the US. Without the US sponsoring it or being the major player supporting it after World War II, it wouldn't have existed. Wouldn't have come into existence.
Its authority is backed by the US hegemony.
Exactly.
So
it's always been like that. It's always been led by the Big Five, the most powerful states on Earth, but it's always been guaranteed by the US, let's say. And so it's interesting that in recent years, but also decades, it's been a long process. So in recent decades, and especially in Trump's years, the US has been at loggerheads with the UN, has been often in the position of protesting what the UN does or not ratifying its resolutions and not ascending to their conventions. This is often explained as through the theory of international relations, which sees the United Nations as challenger to the US. Right. So the current world hegemon is still the US, but it could be the UN. And so what the US and the UN are in short doing are basically a tug of war for the world hegemonic power.
The UN is competing with the US while being backed by the US and guaranteed by that.
And so an interesting discussion that is kind of an offshoot of this is that while a discussion is ongoing regarding the fight between the US and China and who is going to become the world hegemon in the future, a more relevant question would be, is it going to be the US or the UN?
So what's Klaus Schwab's position on this then? What's the title of the book again?
It's COVID-19, column The Great Reset.
Right. So it's based around COVID-19 to promote the Great Reset.
Yes.
Right.
Klaus Schwab has a long career behind him, and he's an accomplished person. And what he's been advocating for decades is for the international sphere, the international system, to have more power, more influence over states, because he sees states as inherently tribalistic. And so if they're tribalistic, if they're looking out for their interests primarily, they won't be eager to cooperate with one another. And if you don't create structures which allow them to operate and which incentivizes them to operate, to cooperate, then they will end up warring with one another. And so to prevent that, you need an international system which is strong enough to induce the states to cooperate and to work together for a brighter future.
And what this is effectively suggesting, in not so many words, is a global government.
Yes.
That is the requirement.
Yes, that's also what I mentioned in the beginning, is that globalism I see as a push for increased role of these international institutions in world politics, and for them to have more powers than they currently have, at the expense of the nation states. That's where the tug of war is in this case. But that's in the short term. But in the long term, this would naturally lead to some kind of world government being formed out of those institutions, not necessarily reflecting the current division of powers among those institutions that we see around us now.
Right, okay. So what's the sort of general structure of his book? How does he lay it out, and what's he proposing?
Right. So when we're talking about the Great Reset in general, we usually mean big societal changes. But what he means is those primarily. That's the biggest part of his book, but there's also other parts. And so the first part is a macro reset, where he talks about big societal, geopolitical, economic changes. Then there is the micro reset part, where he talks about industry and businesses, so the way that companies and corporations operate and should operate in the future to be conducive to the agenda of the Great Reset. And then he talks about an individual reset. I think it should be on the screen as well, the table of contents actually, so that you can see not only the only the big headlines, but also the smaller sections. I think on the screen now should be the whole picture, but I don't think we can't see the whole picture. So the individual reset, the last part, is how to change yourself in a way that's fits in with the worldview,
in concordance with the
exactly.
Great Reset. So redefining our humanness.
Yes.
Do I trust a German economist to redefine my humanness?
Well, I wouldn't, but it's up to each other.
I guess it's each to their own. Right, okay.
So the subsections of that section are the better angels of our nature. That's Steven Pinker's book, famously. So he's talking about whether what people are aiming for is actually good or not, and one thing is that it's an interesting book to read. The other thing is that he's interpreting it in one way, and he's going to be offering his advice on what people should do in light of that.
Right. I'll have to read it actually, because I'm interested in section 3.1.2, moral choices, because this is like the frontier of ethics that he's arrived at here. And after reading his Davos manifesto, I don't think he's much of a philosopher. So I might have to go read that part myself, because I'm very interested. But anyway, let's carry on.
Right. So you said that he's not much of a philosopher. Well, I agree that he's not. His official credentials are economic, but at the same time he holds some weird positions, considering that he's an economist. So, for example, one section of the macro reset, of the economic reset, talks about the degrowth movement, and so
degrowth movement.
Yeah, okay. And I'm going to quote the most relevant part out of this section, so that you and the viewers can get a nice overview of what that means. So, quote, "Some have called for degrowth a movement that embraces zero or even negative GDP growth and that is gaining some traction, at least in the richest countries. As the critique of economic growth moves to center stage, consumerism's financial and cultural dominance in public and private life will be overhauled. This is made obvious in consumer-driven degrowth activism in some niche segments, like advocating for less meat or fewer flights. By triggering a period of enforced degrowth, the pandemic has spurred renewed interest in this movement that wants to reverse the pace of economic growth, leading more than 1,100 experts from around the world to release a manifesto in May 2020, putting forward a degrowth strategy to tackle the economic and human crisis caused by COVID-19. Their open letter calls for the adoption of a democratically planned yet adaptive, sustainable and equitable downscaling of the economy, leading to a future where we can live better with less.
So, I find that very strange framing. I read Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, and one of the things I found most fascinating was the concept of dematerialization that he brought up. And I don't know whether you've read it, but
no.
But what he's saying is advances in technology are actually reducing our material requirements. I mean, he gives the example of your phone. Before, I mean, your phone, like, this is about 20 different devices. You know, it's a desktop computer, it's a telephone, it's, you know, notepads, it's all of these things that would have otherwise required a great deal of resources to put together for you to buy separately, but instead you buy it in your phone. And so all of this stuff no longer exists because it has been compacted into one thing. And this is not an unusual phenomenon. This is actually totally normal and relevant that we see all around us in all forms of life. People just don't realize that technology is advancing that fast, that you know, that just happens. And then there's a new gadget that does loads of other stuff. And so you don't need other gadgets. People forget about the other gadgets. You know, they forget
so that the phone camera doesn't have to look like this.
Exactly. Exactly. You know, like if you look at sort of, you know, an office in the 70s, the desks are full of things, but now I just have this and it does all of the same things. And so this is not a measure of economic growth, of course. This is not saying that we should damage the economy or anything like that, but it's saying, look, we actually use less resources the more technologically advanced we get, because it just makes sense. You know, we actually don't need to change a thing, and where, you know, our sort of raw material consumption is not being it's not growing exponentially. But that seems to be very different, and that's a very positive sort of, you know, forward-looking and enthusiastic way of looking at the progress that we have. Whereas this, like, to actively aim for economic degradation. I mean, I'm not the sort of person who cares about the holy GDP, but I don't want to literally reduce our economic output.
Yeah, I actually wanted to mention two things in relation to this, and you actually now mentioned one of them. That he's right in saying that GDP growth is not something that's automatically right. Yeah. GDP is very dubious in some ways.
Well, Spain's GDP was fantastic after they conquered the New World and enslaved all the natives. I mean, there was amazing GDP, but not very good.
But not just that. There is a lot of criticism of GDP from many sides. So, for example, it doesn't include the work done at home by mostly housewives, things like that.
It's not a measure of the quality of life.
Yeah, but it's not. Neither it is a measure of production or consumption, because it doesn't count large sections of the economy and of what the people produce and what they do, of the services they actually produce. Yeah, and so that's one part of the criticism. But the other part is that GDP is not just the economy. It involves what the state does, and so because the state doesn't face the same competitive constraints on what they do and how they spend money, how they invest and how they consume it, that money can't be properly accounted for as growth in GDP, but yet it's being done that way.
And that's actually a really good point as well, because I mean, if you read some of the sort of more libertarian economists, a lot of them will essentially, you could boil down to what they're saying is government spending is wealth destruction.
Yes. So the thing is, I think the correct argument, the correct framing of this is that you can't account for that spending. So you can't count it as positive, as something that is growth or that should be added to the private GDP, because you don't know whether it's positive or not. And so it might even be negative, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if the government spends on war, for example, and then it destroys wealth somewhere, then it still gets counted as a GDP plus, as addition to GDP.
I mean, war's a great example, because all you're doing is producing machines of destruction. But not just the destruction of someone else's wealth. That's your own wealth. I mean, you know, how much does it cost for a missile? That
yeah, exactly.
like it's millions of dollars per missile, and it's just fired off.
But the way that I'd like to illustrate what I mean is that if you produce weapons, they can work as a deterrent from people attacking you, and so they can have this positive impact.
Yeah.
But you don't know how large that impact is, because it hasn't been done in the private economy. It hasn't been done by someone voluntarily spending their own money, and so you can't say whether it's good or not. Good or not. And but the war example, when you actually use those weapons, is a good way of showing where it is destructive, because it's clearly destructive. So when you're spending on weapons, you don't actually know whether that's good or bad. You can't know, but you add it in GDP anyway.
It's a necessary evil.
When you use them, you add that in the GDP as well, like the people who fly the planes and everything like that.
Yeah.
And so because you have a large portion of GDP invalidated, essentially, it's not a good measure of anything. The larger portion of your GDP the government produces or is sourced through government, the more uninformative it is, and it's misleading and unusable. And so if you have 40% of GDP being government expenditure, something like that is in most Western countries, you have GDP 40% completely unreliable.
Right.
At least, because you also have those other criticisms that I've already mentioned on top of that. And so I agree with him that fixation on GDP is counterproductive, and that this approach should be revised. But at the same time, how he continues is, first he talks about GDP growth, and then one line further he's talking about critique of economic growth, right? It's not the same thing. Mm-hmm. Economic growth is something that exists outside of GDP, that GDP tries to measure but fails.
Yeah.
And so moving against GDP growth might be reasonable, but moving against economic growth is not.
Yeah, because I'm having trouble thinking of a scenario where economic growth is a negative.
That economic growth is a synonym to betterment of
productivity, wealth creation.
Not just that, but of everything that's around you.
Yeah.
Economics is about people's choices and about measuring, about seeing how they act and what the results are. And the fundamentals of economics basically say that if people trade, they make each other better off, and so that's why they do it. Yeah. And then they specialize, and then they are able to produce much more.
Things are built. We find ourselves with the wonderful world we have.
And then everything compounds together, and you have a civilization building up. And so economic growth in that sense is synonymous with a betterment.
Yeah.
Generally, I don't have to even qualify it. It's just that by definition. And it doesn't mean that GDP is the same thing. It's not. No. Right? And so it's really weird that some people are calling for this, but I would understand that, because some people don't really know much about this area, but he's supposed to. He's an economist. So that's what I'm thinking is really weird.
Okay. So what other strange things does he come out with?
So he's... I actually want to quote another section, which is also from the Economic Reset, but from another subsection. I'm not really sure which one now at the moment, but it doesn't really matter. Yeah. So, quote, "The COVID-19 crisis has laid bare the inadequate state of most national health systems, both in terms of costs of lives of patients and of nurses and doctors. In rich countries, where tax-funded health services have suffered for a long time from a lack of resources, the UK National Health Service being the most extreme example, due to political concerns about raising taxes, calls for more spending and therefore higher taxes will get louder, with a growing realization that efficient management cannot compensate for underinvestment. And so I was really surprised at that statement, because you could argue that the NHS hasn't been growing at the pace that you wanted to, but it has been growing, and for a number of years and even decades, I think. Look up the stats.
Dramatically.
But
I actually saw the chart for this.
It has never decreased, right?
No, it's never decreased. And but it was quite a reasonable level. If you go back to like the 60s and 70s as a percentage of GDP, dread to use this. But in 1997, it starts shooting up.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I think to keep up with mass immigration into the country, and even now under the Conservative government, the amount. Its budget just continues to increase. It's never cut. But the complaint from Labour, who are the people pushing this, is always that it's not that it's not going up. It's not going up sufficiently. So they would like more money put into it. Sorry.
No, that's exactly what I meant. It's really curious that he's worried about this, and he's complaining about the NHS being underfunded and suffering from lack of resources, because if the resources have been growing, and they've been growing faster than GDP growth, GDP, well, what can we do?
This is the measurement we've got.
Exactly. We would like to make it better, but it's not done yet.
No.
So if it's been growing faster than GDP, faster than the economy as a whole, let's say, then it can't be underfunded, or it's a stretch to claim that it is underfunded.
I don't think it is, especially we've had 30% contraction in the GDP, and yet the NHS have had their wages frozen, so they're guaranteed. And in Scotland, they're going to give them a £500 bonus or something like that. So
and also it's. People on the left in general, but Klaus Schwab as well, they have this weird conception that austerity in the European context actually means a decrease in government spending. It just means a decrease in the growth of government spending.
Yes.
It's far from what they claim it is.
Yes.
And also you have different types of austerity. You can either you can raise taxes, or you can lower spending, and those have different consequences on the economy as a whole. That's a different discussion, different topic. But those are differences as well. So when they just address austerity or underfunding of some public services, that doesn't really happen.
Yeah,
at least in modern history.
And we can actually give the exact numbers, because I was watching Matt Hancock's COVID briefing. I think it was yesterday or the day before, where he was making Matt Hancock as well is someone who signs on to the Great Reset. He has an article on the government website from 2017 where he was just openly advocating how wonderful the Great Reset is going to be and how we should be doing all of this, because this has been in process for a long time. But Matt Hancock, I saw the full fact check of this. I wish I got it up for this podcast, but I didn't realize we were going to touch on this. The NHS during the COVID crisis was never in danger of being overburdened. If anything, from all the TikTok videos, it looks like it had a lot of free time. But Matt Hancock gave us the data. It turns out that the NHS had at peak been at 89% capacity, which sounds like, oh, well, that sounds high. But that's actually quite normal. The full fact article said, well, it ranges between sort of in the 70s to in the 90s for capacity, and at no point has the NHS been overburdened. We're not even at the sort of like highest average capacity that the NHS arrives at. So, and this has been borne out by various people's experiences of it, because people have got to go to the NHS. I mean, I've been to the NHS myself during the COVID crisis, and it's not overburdened. I can see it, you know. The nurses there will tell you, well, we've been okay. And the government statistics show it. They know it.
Yeah, I'm also aware of situations in some other countries where, for example, there is enough of hospitals and hospital places, but there is not enough nurses, and people actually manage the patients. So things like that can happen and do happen, but in the UK, I believe it was exactly as you said.
Yeah.
And so I want you to also get back to the passage that I quoted, because he says that the underfunding of these public services is the main issue, but he also advocates for more sections of the economy and of society being run in this way. And so he's saying we have problems with funding, we have problems with these things being government controlled, because it doesn't ever get enough funding, it's never properly run in the way that it should be. That's what he says. And
we did just kind of make his argument there. Everything should be run this way. Well, the NHS wasn't overburdened. It seems to have been functioning quite well, actually. We seem to have made his argument. But sorry, go on.
He's complaining about the state of the health services around the world, or around the Western world. So he's not necessarily talking about the UK, although he mentions the NHS as his example of the underfunding of those services. And so under his, I see what you're saying, but I also,
it hasn't been underfunded, and it's actually performed fairly well. So Klaus, I mean, maybe we haven't made his argument really, because if he's saying that the NHS is in crisis, is underfunded, well, that's just not true.
But it's also, it hasn't performed that well in other respects, as you yourself have covered on your channel and your videos. And
it's not for any great joy that I say that, because I do, I think the idea of the National Health Service is a good idea, but it comes with certain demands that you have to have restrictions on, and the reason that they're saying it's underfunded is because of mass immigration. I'm absolutely certain of it. It's just the sheer number of people accessing a service that haven't paid into the service demands that more money go into the service, and if they didn't pay taxes in this country, then it's the native people who already live here who have to pay that. So, but anyway, we won't go into an NHS rant.
Right. And so on the World Economic Forum webpage, you actually have a list of resources, list of articles that are featured on the page, are not necessarily by the World Economic Forum, but that are implicitly endorsed by them, just by being featured on the page.
They don't have a section that says criticism of our plan and then list all of the criticisms,
no.
do they? Exactly.
You wouldn't expect them to.
Of course not. But the point is, we can take it as an endorsement because it's there.
Right. Yes. And so one of those sources is called Project Syndicate, which is a news organization.
Oh, that sounds cyberpunk, doesn't it?
It does, but
Project Syndicate.
I haven't looked into it that closely, but I don't necessarily think it's.
I'm not saying it is.
It's wholly sinister or anything like that.
What a name! That's all I'm saying.
But you're making a good point, because what I wanted to read out were several headlines of articles that they have. I don't actually have access to all those articles. It gets blocked after a bit. There's a paywall. It's really expensive. Their plans are really crazy. I don't know how they're making money. But anyway, I'm gonna read out some of those headlines just to let me know how you feel about it, how they sound. Yeah. So I sorted them from the most easygoing to the kind of more sinister.
Yeah,
Mapping a better future for America's farmers.
Seems fine.
Sure. Post-COVID capitalism.
Sure. I mean, we're going to need to think about that. Yeah. Yep.
So presumably changes
capitalism after COVID's gone.
Yeah, but that it's like how capitalism should change in response to COVID.
Just for anyone who's questioning, capitalism changes all the time. This is why Marx's predictions were all wrong, because capitalism and capitalist countries just changed. They incorporated social welfare systems and things like this.
Before people start screeching, the classical liberals and the libertarian-leaning people, they use this word in a different way. There are different definitions of the word, and the free market economy is not synonymous with capitalism in all its definitions.
Absolutely.
So that's an important caveat, because otherwise the chat is going to be horrible.
Yes, but I mean, but even the libertarians have got to concede that capitalism has changed over time. They have to concede that that's
they would say intrusions to capitalism have changed over time.
They would, but that's still the system that we are describing as capitalism has been modified to fit the needs of the people around.
But you're using the other definition.
I am, yes. Okay, Karen.
So So let's go on.
I'm not using a purist definition, that's true.
Digital finance for a fairer post-pandemic world.
I mean, there's nothing innately horrific about that.
The recovery needs development aid.
It possibly will.
You think so?
Maybe. I'd need to know more about what they're saying, really.
So have we actually covered on the podcast the cutting of development aid by the UK? I don't think we have.
Is this international?
Yeah.
Oh, right. I was thinking internal. So like for example, I think there's a good chance that when we're actually allowed out of our homes and allowed to run our businesses again, which technically we are now, actually, I shouldn't complain too much. There are going to be a lot of claims, at least moral claims, that small business owners are entitled to some sort of aid to get their small businesses back up.
I don't think this is what they mean.
But that's not what they mean. They're talking
the phrase development aid is very much connected to the international space.
Right.
The public's business.
Doesn't sound like their business.
It sounds like
my business.
Everything personal is political.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Building back fairer and greener.
Okay.
You know where this is going.
Yeah.
What should corporations do? How the pandemic can revolutionize climate policy.
Right.
The need for a great transformation.
I knew we were going to get the Green New Deal somehow.
Last but not least, avoiding a climate lockdown.
There we go. Climate lockdown. Imagine. I mean, we're already in the era where lockdowns are just normal now.
Exactly. So that's the danger. If it gets normalized, if it happens for the third time, the third cookie.
That's it. It's immoral.
So there have been 2 sets of lockdowns now.
Yep. We could go for a third one. We could have a climate lockdown. There could be a lockdown for anything now, couldn't there? Anything that scares the government enough, and they can lock us down.
Not yet. There have been 2, not 3.
Yeah, but what I mean is, like, the precedents have been set.
I know what you mean.
It's all there. How are we going to appeal? Well, you conceded to the previous 2. Why wouldn't you do the third? It's like, good point. I guess I'll stay in my house and I won't earn any money, and I'll own nothing but be happy, according to them. But sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
Yeah.
My point was what you were saying the other day on the podcast, that having 2 cookies is not something that creates precedents, but having 3.
Yeah, well, that's it. It's true. The sort of third time is the charm, isn't it?
Yeah.
But okay.
So the idea of a climate lockdown is basically that you have a dire situation.
I'm sure they'll create one.
The climate is deteriorating, and you have an emergency, otherwise the world will end, and so you need to institute a lockdown similar to what happened during COVID, or what's happening during COVID, to address these issues.
And that's literally going to be the language they use as well. If you don't do this, the world will end. That's what they'll say.
It's not what they will say; it's
what they are saying.
They have been saying for decades.
That's true.
So those are the kind of important parts of the Great Reset book that I wanted to mention on this podcast. But I've also written up an article that actually
was that published today? Was it?
It was published this morning.
Excellent.
And it's on the page, and it's not premium content, so you can enjoy a taste of what premium content is like.
That's right. Go to lotusisa.com and check that out by Hugo. It's it's good stuff.
So the article is called An Actual Great Reset, which ties into what I said at the very beginning, that this Great Reset is actually what they have been doing and what they have been planning and intending to do for decades.
It's a continuation of at least 20 years worth of political direction, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's not just the history, it's that each part of how the politics has progressed goes this way. The Great Reset just means do it faster and do it in a more intense way. And so what I'm proposing instead is, okay, let's make, if we have established that we want to do a Great Reset, if you want to institute big changes to society, let's propose something that actually makes sense. So I'm saying what they're proposing is going to make things worse, because it's just a continuation of the things that are wrong with politics and the social sphere at the moment, and instead I'm proposing changes that could make it better. So I recommend everyone to read it, because I think it's worth it.
I think so too. I do agree. Right. The again redefining our humanness. I haven't read it yet, but I'm always very skeptical about anyone who says this because, again, there seems to be a very utilitarian ethic that is behind all of this, and fundamentally, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again because I'm a tireless crusader against utilitarianism at this point. There appears to be the attitude that happiness can be given to people, as in, and we saw this in the video that they took down from Twitter, where they'd in the video, you will own nothing and you will be happy. You don't know that I'll be happy. You can't give me happiness. Happiness is not something that can be aggregated and doled out. It can't be redistributed.
And the person in the video looks very unhappy and desperate.
They do look like they're about to do something tragic. That's right. I don't agree that being merely a transient renter in life is actually a path to happiness. And I don't care if Klaus Schwab thinks that. I just don't trust him, and he has got no claim to my property. So
when you were saying before that that is probably going to be something along the lines of utilitarianism, Klaus Schwab actually sees it as something wrong as well. It's something that shouldn't really be followed because it's more often than not used as a swear word or as something that is a bit dirty that you don't want to do. You want to stick to your principles. You don't want to be utilitarian. That's on almost all sides. And so he says...
Really? I always hear it in a positive manner.
Really?
It's very utilitarian, isn't it? It's like, yeah, but that's not good.
At least
that's 10 people deciding that one of them gets murdered and the other 9 being happy with it or something.
That's interesting. My experience is completely different from the world of academia.
Right, okay, that's very interesting.
So I'm quoting from the moral choices section. Like all notions of moral philosophy, the idea of common good is elusive and contestable. Since the pandemic started, it has provoked furious debates about whether to use a utilitarian calculus when trying to tame the pandemic, or to stick to the sacrosanct principle of sanctity of life. So that's the framing that he offers.
That's terrible framing.
It is.
That's absolutely awful. Okay. I'll probably do a separate video on this in the next few days. I'll probably read some of this over the weekend or something, and come back with why Klaus Schwab should shut up and go home.
And so the redefining our humanness section, I think, what it mostly focuses on is the idea of the common good and about convincing you that you should care for the common good, and you should not elevate your own interests above the common good, and that you should care about other people, you should care about humanity, and you should be willing to sacrifice your own interests in the interests of the common good. And so I think that's going to be a running theme in that section.
Oh, I'm very looking forward to getting through that section.
Even though I only read a part of it,
it's a confused thing that he's saying there. The common good includes your interests.
Yes.
And that's why the common good is actually quite I don't want to say thin, but I can't think of a better way of describing it. That you can't actually hang much on the common good because if you're going to advance an interest that's your interest and not someone else's interest, then you have already broken the common good. This is why human rights are considered the common good, right? That we all aspire to because they're individual. Everyone has these human rights, and so if we protect these human rights, then we can say we are arguing the common good. But anything beyond that, anything sort of constructed or that would require sort of compelled labor or anything like that, then you're going into a greater good scenario. You've abandoned the common good.
I think that's actually they use those things as synonyms.
That's the problem.
Common good is the greater good.
That's the problem, because they're actually antonyms. You can have the greater good or you can have the common good, but you can't have both at the same time.
So I'm gonna...
The greater good's quite a strong concept, though.
I'm gonna botch the quote, but I want to invoke Machiavelli, and not Prince by Machiavelli, but discourses. He was a Republican. He was not a monarchist. So his main piece of work is the Discourses on Livy, where he lays out what the realm should look like, what the Republican government should look like. And so he says that the common good should be at the center stage of the Republic, and that the proper ordering of the city, which he focuses on because
he was a diplomat in Florence.
Exactly. So is the context.
But it's the same principle.
And so what he says is that the city should, everyone in the city should be poor, but the city should be rich. So everyone should be living at poverty level, basically. They shouldn't own anything, but the public coffer should be full. And so that the city as a whole can do great things. It can build monuments, great cathedrals, and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, you can achieve real glory and real success as a republic.